Thank you again, folks. Let's go ahead and get started here, folks. All right. God's word tells us, "Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night. The Lord of hosts is his name." Folks, let's go to the moon on NASA's Boldest mission and learn some very inspirational truths. But before we do so, we should say a word about our moon, folks, and see why it's very, very special and why we know it was created. Starting with, why do we have the moon? Why did God put it there? What's its purpose anyway? Glad you asked. Number one, moon comes in handy for romance. On top of that, comes in handy for selling telescopes. But there are 5 more reasons for the moon, folks. Number one, biblically speaking, the Bible tells us God gave us the moon to serve as a light by night. Nature's biggest nightlight, folks, right? Secondly, Bible tells us God gave us the moon to serve the purpose of a calendar. But there are 3 more reasons, folks, at least. And we'll talk more about 2 of these in a minute. The moon is critical with regard to our ocean's tides and also serving as a counterbalance for our Earth as it rotates on its axis. A 5th reason, folks, that we'll talk more about right now, the moon serves as a meteorite shield. The fact of the matter is, folks, until the Apollo missions, we really didn't appreciate the fact that the far side of the moon has layer after layer or stratum after stratum of craters left by meteorites. If the moon was not there, folks, where are all those meteors going? They're going to Earth. So I'm glad the moon is there, folks, aren't you? And Dr. Werner Von Braun, father of the American space program, he commented, "As I became exposed to the law and order of the universe, I was literally humbled by its unerring perfection. I became convinced that there must be divine intent behind it all. My experiences with science led me to evolution." Is that what he said, folks? Led him to God, didn't it? Or America's most famous astronaut, John Glenn, he said, "To look out at this creation and not believe in God is to me impossible. It just strengthens my faith." But moving on, for the sake of time, let's talk about the when of the moon, its age. How old is it? Most of my evolutionary friends, and we might have some here today, we're honored you're with us, maintain the moon has to be at least 4 billion years. The fact of the matter is, as we discussed in a different program, there's a lot of evidence that says otherwise. Maybe consider 2 of these 5 fascinating clues pointing to a very young moon. Case in point, lunar orbital recession. You might have seen a book with a chart depicting Earth and the moon. For the sake of space, there's really no way that they can depict the fact that if the moon was that small red dot in the upper right-hand corner and the Earth was that blue dot in a corner, that better represents the space between our Earth and moon. So it's a bit farther away than it is in the books, isn't it? The thing is, folks, the moon is leaving us. That's right. Each year, our moon gets 1.6 inches farther from the Earth. It's called lunar recession. Folks, if you crunch the numbers, it works perfectly in terms of a young moon. But folks, if the moon was very, very old, the moon would be gone by now. And by the way, in our program, to keep folks awake that might not like science, you might notice we'll have a few little items along the way, okay? Supermen and that kind of thing. But back to our subject. A second indicator, among others, for a young created moon, insufficient lunar micrometeorite dust. For example, Carl Sagan scared everybody. He said the moon is at least 4 billion years old. It should be covered with thousands of feet of meteorite dust accumulated on it. It was Neil Armstrong's #1 worry aboard Apollo 11. Well, you know what, folks? They had nothing to worry about. NASA put cat whiskers on the lunar module. They were 5.5 foot long poles. And these cat whiskers, which are very hard to see ordinarily, when the tips came in contact with the lunar surface, it would let the astronauts know they're about to land in spite of all the dust that'd be blowing around. Well, guess what? There wasn't much dust blowing around. And guess what? The cat whiskers almost immediately went through a thin layer of dust and hit rock and bent outwards, creating a trip hazard for the astronauts. Even more interesting, I think, and it's kind of sad too, since I'm rather patriotic, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had a terrible time getting our flagpole into the moon because they thought there'd be lots of dust. Instead, within 6 inches, they hit rock. They could not get the pole to go in far enough. And you know, Buzz Aldrin, he said just before they left the lunar surface, he looked out the window, and guess what? Old Glory was lying in the lunar dirt. Some people, they want to refute this, but folks, all I can tell you is I got to have an extended conversation with a NASA historian, and I had an extended conversation with a retired NASA engineer and former F-100 fighter pilot. They both confirmed everything I just told you about the lunar module and the dust. In fact, that engineer worked on the lunar module's landing legs. So I think he probably would know what he's talking about, right? By the way, speaking of lunar dust, one of the many Christian astronauts in our program, Charlie Duke, Apollo 16, who said that compared to his walk with Jesus Christ, walking on the moon was literally the dust of my life. But next, moving on, for the sake of time, we turn to the what of the moon, its remarkable design. That's right. We've touched upon this before, briefly. In terms of the moon's size and density, folks, it's just right. We are told by astrophysicists if our moon was approximately 5 to 10% smaller or lighter, there would be insufficient gravity for the tides of the seas. Our shorelines would all become swampland. That would be really bad, especially for us here, wouldn't it? But then, folks, we're told if our moon was approximately 5 to 10% bigger or heavier, there would be too much gravitation, and as a result, we'd have tragic earthquakes. Regarding the distance of the moon from the Earth and the shape of its orbit, almost all moons in our solar system, about 200 of them, have a very, very oval orbit, elliptical. Our moon is extremely unusual for several reasons, one of them being our moon's orbit is almost perfectly round and at just the right distance. Indeed, folks, we're back to the tides of the seas. If our moon was very much farther from the Earth, we're back to insufficient gravity for the tides of the seas. We're back to swampy beaches. But if our moon was much closer to the Earth, we're back to earthquakes again, folks. And then, folks, there's the angle of the moon in its orbit as it revolves around the Earth. It's extremely unusual, among many other things. Almost all moons in our solar system, they orbit around their planet along the equator. Our moon doesn't. It orbits around the Earth along what's called the ecliptic, the path the Earth takes around the sun. Very unusual and very important, folks, because it serves as a counterbalance to stabilize our Earth as it rotates on its axis. Things would be a disaster, folks, without the moon. We have all kinds of wild changes in weather. It would be absolutely horrible, horrible, horrible. But by the way, God decided to put the moon 5 degrees off. Why? So the moon would not keep eclipsing the sun, giving us solar eclipses. Now, a solar eclipse is pretty cool, isn't it? But we don't want one all day long, do we? And likewise, folks, we don't want a lunar eclipse all night long either. We could go on, but folks, even secular scientists admit the moon is a huge, major reason why the planet Earth is the Goldilocks planet. It is just right. In fact, I just recently finished reading a book by a secular astronomer. The entire book was on the theme, what if the moon didn't exist? And guess what, folks? It's all very bad news. Last man on the moon, Apollo 17. Gene Cernan said, he just passed away recently. He said, a creator placed our world, our sun, and our moon where they are in the dark void. It is all just too perfect and beautiful to have happened by chance. And he should know, folks, he was there, wasn't he? Well, we could go on and on about that. But finally, we now turn to the how. How did we get the moon here? Its origin. One of the purposes of the Apollo program was to discover which of 4 different views was correct for the evolution of the moon. Was the moon a daughter planet of the Earth, ejected from the Pacific Ocean basins, called the fission theory? Was the moon a sister planet of the Earth, evolving at the same time, called the parallel theory? Was the moon an adopted planet, captured by the Earth, called the capture theory? And then, frankly, was the moon a combination of all 3 of these, and called the impact theory? Folks, the math, the analysis of moon rocks, and most of all, just plain common sense, teleology, which is all about design and nature, folks, all of these theories failed to make sense. The only theory that still makes the most sense is just plain special creation by God. That brings us to Air Force Colonel Frank Borman. We'll hear some more from him in a minute. In lunar orbit, he said, "I had an enormous feeling there had to be a power greater than any of us, that there is a God." Or speaking of power, Colonel James Irwin, you can identify him in the stamp on the left-hand side there. Everybody see him? That's him. He said, "I felt the power of God like I'd never felt it before." Truly, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. We could go on and on and on, but you might call this part 2 of our program this morning. Let's now turn to NASA's boldest journey, NASA's boldest mission. And frankly, folks, many historians believe that this was mankind's boldest journey ever. How many of us old people who remember Apollo 11, landing on the moon? Totally awesome, right? Okay. Well, folks, I'm right there with you, okay? It was a very thrilling time. But you know what happened? After a whole lot of research, and then after visiting various NASA centers, such as these here, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, or the Manned Space Flight Center in Houston, Texas, which is a must-see, by the way, I think, the Langley Research Center in Virginia, and the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, after talking with astronauts and engineers and historians at these centers and some other places, I reached a conclusion, I guess already reached by some other people. Apollo 11, awesome, exciting, right? School kids learn about it for sure in school, right? Whoa, guess what? Almost everything Apollo 11 did had already been done. That's right, by Apollo 8. And hardly anybody has heard of Apollo 8. Especially if you're a younger person and you did not live at that time. This historian said Apollo 8's voyage was as pioneering as Apollo 11's 7 months later, and more dangerous. Or Ken Mattingly, who became famous because of Apollo 13, said, "I consider Apollo 8 the most significant event. Compared to it, Apollo 11 was," ready for this, "anticlimactic." Neil Armstrong, Apollo 11, first man walk on the moon, right? He said Apollo 8 was enormously bold, in many ways more important than the achievements of Apollo 11. Furthermore, folks, consider this. Neil Armstrong would never have become a household name if it had not been for Apollo 8. Why is that? How many here know who Pete Conrad was? Don't feel bad. Only a geek like me would know this. Pete Conrad was the commander of Apollo 12. Apollo 12 was supposed to be the first mission to land on the moon. Since he was the commander, he would be the first man to walk on the moon, right? Guess what? Apollo 8 was so incredibly successful, NASA moved up their timetable. Apollo 11 would be the first lunar landing mission. And since Neil Armstrong was the commander of Apollo 11, he would get to be the first man to walk on the moon. And guess what? Nobody remembers Pete Conrad at all, do they? On Apollo 12. The UK Guardian said you could easily argue that Apollo 8 and not Apollo 11 deserves the title of the greatest event of the 20th century. Now, some of you are thinking, and I can see why, Tom, you're really confused. This is church. This is not aeronautical history. Why are you boring us with this stuff? Please bear with me, folks. Many people, and I would agree with them, believe God had everything to do with the survival and success of Apollo 8. And for three very good reasons. Number one, now Pastor is our theologian here. Pastor, would you agree that those who honor God will be honored by God? Is that logical? Okay, we're good. Apollo 8, those crew members honored God more than all other manned space flights in history combined. Number two, according to the New York Times, more people were praying for Apollo 8, they estimate 500 million people. More people were praying for Apollo 8 than any other event in history until Apollo 13 came along. And then number three, folks, Apollo 8 needed all the prayer it could get. And it needed all the help from God they could possibly receive. Case in point, the Los Angeles Times recently had a feature article about Apollo 8. It said Apollo 8 was NASA's first moonshot, a bold and terrifying improvisation. The mission was mind-blowing and dangerous. 50 years later, it's hard to remember how scary Apollo 8 was. No space mission had ever presented so many exotic ways to kill astronauts. One of my favorite museums is the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. May I ask, has anybody been there before? A couple of you? Anytime I'm in Chicago, whether it was back in my Air Force Reserve days or in ministry, I always try to go to that museum, folks, and the first thing I got to see is this. That is the world's first true spacecraft, the Apollo 8 capsule. Down below, there's a placard that reads, staggering in its audacity, stunning in its complexity, and sobering in its dangers, Apollo 8 journeyed 250,000 miles from Earth, 1,000 times farther than any before. Now, you might be thinking, Tom, you're really confused. You said it was the first true spacecraft. What about Mercury? What about Gemini? What about the Russians? With all due respect, folks, these were all amazing missions. No man a space journey ever got farther than 200 to 300 miles from the Earth. You know that? Nobody got any farther than low Earth orbit. Gemini 11 got 851 miles from the Earth because of an Agena rocket booster they used. Apollo 8 was going a little bit farther than that. Apollo 8 wasn't going 851 miles. Apollo 8 was going to make a non-stop, go-for-broke cannonball journey into deep space almost 250,000 miles away. A little bit farther, folks, don't you think? This historian said Apollo 8 was the most daring endeavor ever undertaken by man. America needed something good to happen. The director of NASA, the famous James Webb, was approached with a flight plan for Apollo 8. He looked at it and he politely replied, "Are you out of your mind?" When Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, overruled him, James Webb said, "Nobody's dying on my watch," and he resigned. This historian said nobody had any illusions about how dicey the Apollo 8 plan was. Susan Borman, the wife of Frank Borman, the commander of Apollo 8, went to the senior, very famous flight controller, Chris Kraft, and said, "Chris, tell me the truth. What are the odds of my husband coming back home?" He said, "Don't worry, Susan. They're pretty good. We figure 50-50. The Apollo 8 crew members tried to get their wives and families prepared as much as they could, but Susan Borman read over the flight plan and she was stunned. She could not believe how many dangerous things the Apollo 8 crew would be doing that had never, ever been done by anybody before. She began preparing her husband's funeral service. Bill Anders gave his wife a cassette tape and said, "Honey, I think I have a 1 out of 3 chance of success on this mission. On Christmas Day, if NASA declares me dead, please get together with the kids and listen to this cassette tape. Marilyn Lovell, wife of Jim Lovell, who'd become very famous because of Apollo 13, said she never prayed so hard in her life. This is a very famous photograph. It appeared on the front page of newspapers around the world. It depicts very graphically the shocked looks on the members of the Lovell family as they looked up at the top of the 36-story tall Saturn V rocket that had Jim Lovell aboard. Jim Lovell was a navigator for Apollo 8, and afterwards he said, you know, the odds of trying to be successful were overwhelming, and perhaps at that time we didn't even understand what the odds actually were. For those of you who are techies, you're going to love this. He was a navigator. And folks, this is 1968. Jim Lovell navigated almost 250,000 miles into outer space using a Navy sextant, a slide rule. How many remember slide rules? I remember in organic chemistry, we were allowed by our teacher to use a slide rule because there were so many computations we had to make. And he used a computer with a hard drive space of a 1/40th of a floppy disk. And folks, consider this. When you go to the moon, you don't aim your rocket at the moon, do you? Because the moon is moving. You aim your rocket where you hope the moon will be exactly in 3 days when it needs to be there. My favorite book on Apollo 8 for the family is Apollo 8, The Mission That Changed Everything. In the book, the author says Apollo 8 was the trickiest mission. Some even said it was doomed, but the tiniest error could result in the astronauts being stranded forever. Apollo 8 was so dangerous, there were rumors that were false, but there were rumors that were rampant that NASA had issued suicide capsules to their crew members in case they were lost in space. The first big problem facing Apollo 8 was the booster rocket, the Saturn V rocket. By the way, the Saturn V rocket was mainly designed by Werner Von Braun, the father of the modern American Day space program. He was the chief designer for most of our early rockets. He was a hero of the hero in the film October Sky. May I ask, how many have seen October Sky? A number of you. Is that a great movie or what? It's not technically a Christian film, but boy, it teaches all kinds of great character qualities. I've seen it probably at least 5 times. Anyway, Werner Von Braun was famous for a number of things. He was famous for his sense of humor. He could have been a stand-up comic. He used to say things like, research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing. We can lick gravity, but sometimes the paperwork is overwhelming. In outer space, your tax dollar will go farther, literally. But he also, folks, was a staunch, adamant, Bible-believing creationist. And he made no apologies, and everywhere he went, he was saying things like this. Anything as well ordered and perfectly created as our earth and universe must have had a maker, a master designer. Anything so orderly, so perfect, so precisely balanced, so majestic as this creation can only be the product of a divine idea. There must be a maker. There can be no other way. He should know. He was a rocket scientist. Well, Werner Von Braun collected some enemies because of his views, and they tried to smear him. His enemies tried to claim that he was a German World War II criminal of some kind. Well, we're not going to chase a rabbit about that, but may I make just a couple comments. Number one, this is Eli Rosenbaum. He's America's most famous German World War II criminal chaser, okay? Amazing story. They should make a movie about him. I got to meet him, talk with him, and exchange emails with him afterwards. I played devil's advocate to get a better, honest answer from him. He emphasized to me there was no case to be made against Werner Von Braun for being a war criminal. And he even sent me some recommended reading to back up his position. Amy S. Tiedel has written the latest book about Werner Von Braun. She reached the same conclusion, that he was not a war criminal. By the way, did I forget to mention something? These two people, both of them, are Jewish. Do you think a Jewish person is going to cut Werner Von Braun any slack? Werner Von Braun, folks, no matter what he was, we know that in 1962, a NASA engineer led him to the Lord using a Gideon Bible, something the Gideons are very proud of. Werner Von Braun insisted he wanted a very simple grave marker, and the only thing on it besides his name and dates would be Psalm 19:1, "The heavens declare the glory of God." Well, back to our subject, Saturn V rocket. It still is the biggest, most powerful operational rocket in history. You see it measuring up to various other things. Guess what, folks? We're in Boeing country, right? Folks, the first stage of the Saturn V had more power than 30 747s combined. But there was a price to be paid for that. It was called the Beast. NASA was very leery about the Saturn V, folks. If it blew up, they estimated the blast would be worse than that of a thermonuclear warhead being detonated. When they test fired the Saturn V rocket just before Apollo 8, it failed miserably, and it would have killed anybody aboard. They tried to get all the bugs worked out of it, and Apollo 8 would be next. On launch day, NASA was so nervous, they evacuated the area around the rocket for an area of 13 square miles. Jim Lovell said he looked down as they were climbing aboard the capsule, way up 360 feet up in the air. He looked down and he said, "Guys, do they know something we don't know?" Because everybody was running away. But folks, the launch was almost perfect. The crew of the crew of Apollo 8 became the fastest human beings in history. They were flying over 24,000 miles per hour. They broke out of Earth's orbit. They penetrated the Van Allen radiation belts, and they entered for the first time in history outer space. Frank Borman said he looked back and saw something nobody had ever seen before. He saw the entire planet Earth. And he got choked up, he said. He commented, "This must be what God sees." Along the way, Jim Lovell, even though he was a Navy fighter pilot, he admitted throughout the entire journey, which took about a week, he said over and over and over again, he'd look outside a window and he would keep thinking to himself the famous words concluding the Air Force poem, High Flight. "I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God." Another of the many challenges facing Apollo 8 for the first time ever, very dangerous challenges, they did not have a lunar module available. And you're thinking, well, they weren't going to land on the moon yet. You're right. But the lunar module was also supposed to be a lifeboat in case anything happened to their capsule. And as you might recall, that's exactly what happened with Apollo 13, right? They had an explosion. They had to use a lunar module. If that had happened to Apollo 8, end of story. Next major challenge, and boy, we could go into some detail about this, folks. We can during Q&A if you want. To me, this is the most daring, exciting, poignant time. Lunar orbit insertion. No manned spacecraft had ever rendezvoused with the moon. Apollo 8, they are traveling almost 6,000 miles per hour, and they have to do it backwards. They have to rendezvous with the moon just exactly right. The moon isn't standing still, though, is it? It's traveling laterally sideways over 2,000 miles per hour. They had to reach orbit in the moon just exactly right. And again, we could talk about the drama of that later if you want. Back on the Earth, George Low, he's the one who came up with the Apollo 8 program. He said, if you weren't shaking, you didn't understand the problems. Marilyn Lovell quietly said, they must be in God's hands. Let me throw this in. A NASA historian told me that for about 20 minutes, Apollo 8 would be behind the moon, out of radio contact. And they said on the ground, NASA did not know for 20 minutes if Apollo 8 was in lunar orbit, had hit the moon, or missed the moon altogether. They told me it was the longest 20 minutes in NASA history. But folks, they made it, didn't they? They reached lunar orbit against all odds, orbited it 10 times. They were the first human beings to see the far side of the moon, causing Frank Borman to say, to boldly go where no man has gone before. And I confess, folks, he took those lines from what? A certain sci-fi series that was new on TV, and it was what, folks? Star Trek. There's a lot we could say about Apollo 8 and lunar orbit. May I say two things regarding Apollo 8 and God? Number one, when Frank Borman was approached with the program, the Apollo 8 mission program, he looked it over and said, hey, this takes place over Christmas time. I'm supposed to pray for my church's Christmas Eve service. NASA said, you still can. Frank Borman read his prayer from lunar orbit, broadcasted by NASA. Secondly, folks, big event. On the 9th orbit around the moon, Frank Borman led his crew in the reading of the creation account in the Bible from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 10. How many remember that? This was a very, very big deal. Very exciting, folks. They took turns reading those 10 verses. Frank Borman commented, I saw evidence God lives. Reading from Genesis gave us a new meaning, a new grasp of the miracle of evolution. Is that what he said, folks? Anybody? Somebody. What did he say? How many are awake? Creation, exactly. This historian noted, inside mission control, nobody moved. Then one after another, these scientists and engineers in Houston began to tear up. How many remember? This is Walter Cronkite. Okay, a few of us old people. Walter Cronkite became very famous. He was the voice of NASA during all of this, okay? Walter Cronkite admitted, I admit that I had tears in my eyes. It was really impressive and just the right thing to do, the right thing. Gene Kranz, mission controller at this time, became famous in the film Apollo 13. He was called NASA's top steely-eyed missile man. Nothing fazed him. He made Mr. Spock look like a clown. Gene Kranz afterwards said, for those moments I felt the presence of creation and the Creator. Tears were on my cheeks. The emotion was just unbelievable. By the way, how many here saw Apollo 13? How many remember that very dramatic scene? It's very dramatic. Ed Harris, playing Gene Kranz, says, failure is not an option. How many remember that? One slight detail. Gene Kranz didn't say it, folks. This Christian flight controller said it. Jerry Bostick. He was approached by Ron Howard, producer of Apollo 13. He became the technical advisor for Apollo 13. During one of his interviews, he said those words. Failure was not an option. Ron Howard loved it and said, we've got to put that in the movie. He said, well, have Gene Kranz say it. The real Gene Kranz said, I never said it, but I like it. So he named his biography, Failure is Not an Option. And he's gotten the credit ever since. This is one more example, folks. We can't trust Hollywood. Okay, I'm sorry. That's harsh, Pastor, isn't it? I'm sorry. You can trust a Hollywood movie or TV program if it has nothing to do with the Bible or science or the police or lawyers or doctors and nurses or the army or our military period or archaeologists, psychologists. Folks, you can't trust Hollywood, but we can always trust in the Bible. Personally, I think Apollo 13 gets about an 80% for accuracy, which is pretty good for Hollywood, by the way. The real Jerry Bostick said, after the crew read Genesis 1 in lunar orbit, thank you, Lord, for letting me be here and be part of this. General Phillips from NASA and NASA Geographic said, 3 astronauts who have seen the evidence of creation paused to read the most appropriate words imaginable, the majestic opening words of Genesis. Another historian said for a global audience of 1 billion people, they took turns reading Genesis Bible verses of renewal in a year of loss. Folks, the New York Times estimates that 1 billion people on earth saw or heard Apollo 8 read Genesis chapter 1. And the networks, when they found that out, they kept playing this over and over and over again. And remember, this is back in the days when there were 3 major channels. And I'll never forget, I went to my mother and said, Mom, I said, I've already seen Apollo 8's broadcast 7 times. Why did they have to cancel Star Trek to show it again? Oh, I forgot to mention, folks, the broadcast of Apollo 8 became the most watched program of any kind in TV history. The crew was given an Emmy Award when they got underground. Well, not everybody liked Apollo 8 reading Genesis 1 in orbit. How many remember Marilyn O'Hare? She was called the most hated woman in America, our most famous atheist. She's the one who got prayer and Bible study out of our public schools back in 1964. She sued NASA and tried to have prayer and Bible study banned from outer space. She was furious over the Apollo 8 broadcast. Well, it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And guess what happened? The Supreme Court ruled against her. Although one of the justices said, I didn't know we had jurisdiction over the moon anyway. Back on the ground, the acting director of NASA, Thomas Paine, said, it's the triumph of the squares, the guys with the computers and slide rules who read the Bible on Christmas Eve. Bill Anders said, hey, we were just trying to say something sort of fundamental, something that will stop and grab people's guts. I would love to interview Bill Anders. He actually lives up north. I did get to talk with his wife on the phone, and she appreciated my great interest in Apollo 8 and kind of sighed over the fact that hardly anybody knows anything about what they did. In fact, Bill Anders is the one who took the famous photograph, Earthrise. How many have seen Earthrise? It's the most famous photograph ever taken by NASA, and of course became my favorite postage stamp. This historian said, to see the Earth rising beyond the moon on Christmas Eve was all the confirmation of a creator that Colonel Borman needed. But folks, it was time to head back home. 3 days, folks, 250,000 miles, are facing new dangers, new challenges nobody had ever encountered before. Things were so risky that Chris Kraft got on the PA system at Mission Control and said, look, you guys, I'm going to sit here and pray a little bit, and I'd like to have it quiet. Among other dangers, folks, was reaching the Earth. Earth's orbital insertion. Bill Anders said we had to come home 240,000 miles to hit something that was a reentry target about the size of a letter slot seen from 4 miles away. And then, folks, there was actual reentry. No manned spacecraft had ever re-entered the Earth's atmosphere from outer space. All of the rules were completely different. They would be plunging through the Earth's atmosphere backwards at over 25,000 miles per hour, far faster than any spacecraft had ever flown of any kind before, and the heat shield would get far, far hotter. The heat shield would spike at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is almost as hot as the surface of the sun. Well, as you can imagine, NASA was pretty worried about this. So they decided that Apollo 8, first time for a manned spacecraft, it would skip across the Earth's atmosphere first to slow down and cool down. You guessed it, nobody had ever done that before. It was all experimental, folks. By the way, on top of everything else, Apollo 8, out of necessity, would be the first manned spacecraft re-entering the Earth's atmosphere at night. And boy, I would pay good money to be on a Boeing 707 off the coast of Hawaii. They saw the re-entry of Apollo 8. The senior pilot said, we saw this fireball, and he said, we estimate the blazing, burning trail behind it was 125 miles long. But folks, they made it, didn't they? The NASA people I have spoken to have told me that no space flight in history faced as many challenges and dangers than Apollo 8. But they said, ironically, Apollo 8 was one of the most successful picture-perfect missions ever. And they said it's ironic when you consider all the new dangerous things they had to do. Bottom line, folks, they tell me NASA's boldest mission, and more historians think it was mankind's boldest journey ever. The only thing that really went wrong in Apollo 8 is poor Frank Borman had a motion sickness problem. When they landed in the water for splashdown, he got deathly seasick, waiting for the Navy to pull him out. Kind of ignominious, folks. The New York Times said the travels that earned immortality for Apollo, Columbus, and Magellan all fade before the incredible achievement of the Apollo 8 crew. How many remember David Brinkley, as in Huntley and Brinkley? Some of us old people, right? They were the competitors of Walter Cronkite. He said, it was almost unreasonably perfect. It will be remembered as long as the human race lasts. That part's not true, folks. Hardly anybody remembers it anymore. Folks, you might say that Apollo 11, as great as it was, basically flew in the footprints of Apollo 8. Apollo 8 had already done almost everything except for actually landing on the moon. No wonder, Time magazine booted the President of the United States off the front cover of their Man of the Year issue and put the crew of Apollo 8 there instead. Neil Armstrong didn't even get in the Man of the Year issue, neither did John Glenn. Time magazine said that Apollo 8 was a particularly providential blessing in a time of disruption and despond. Susan Borman said, look at all the prayers around the world that pulled this thing through. Valerie Anders said, as for prayer, giving thanks is a course from which we never graduate. Apollo 8 was not just a political victory or scientific victory or a military victory. Folks, it was a spiritual victory. Do you know why? It was a spiritual victory over godless communism by a nation that, especially at that time, was much more God-oriented. My favorite adult book about Apollo 8 is by Robert Zimmerman. He wrote, Yuri Gagarin, the famous Russian astronaut, proclaimed he saw no God in space. Borman, Lovell, and Anders saw him everywhere and said so. Jim Lovell afterwards said, we arrived on a planet that had the right amount of mass to have the gravity to contain water and an atmosphere. Just at the proper distance from a star, it appeared to me that God had given mankind sort of a stage. Frank Borman said, the more we learn about the wonders of our universe, the more clearly we are going to perceive the hand of God. Susan Borman commented, God has been so very good. I honestly to this day believe with every cell of my body that Apollo 8 was just a lucky chance. Is that what she said, folks? What'd she say, folks? That's right, a miracle. As we wrap things up here, folks, Joseph Ellis, I've read a number of his biographies, especially his classic on George Washington. He's a very secular man, but he actually admitted crucial moments in American history have turned on what? Providential events that defy rational explanation. We conclude, though, with the words of Buzz Aldrin aboard Apollo 11 on the moon. Many people don't realize this, but he read, when I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him?